Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with guest John M. Chenoweth, an Associate Professor of Anthropology at University of Michigan, Dearborn, who is an anthropologist and historical archaeologist studying the archaeology of religion and the negotiations between religion, race, class, and other social identities. We will be discussing the religious society of Friends, Quakers, in the British Virgin Islands. So let's have a listen.
So I just wanted to thank you so much, Professor Chenoweth, for coming on to the podcast and speaking about Quakers in the British Virgin Islands, as this is, again, another narrative that's not really spoken about, but again, just wanted to have you come on, speak to this, and to give a more, more background information about the Quakers, and again, another type of complex topic. So before we start, if we can just have you just give a brief introduction of yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks very much, Wendy, for having me on. This is great to have this podcast. So yeah, I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan at Dearborn, one of the three campuses of University of Michigan. So we're just outside of Detroit. And I've been an historical archaeologist for about 20 years now. And I've worked in a lot of different places in the US and working on projects here in Michigan. But probably most of my research has been down in the Caribbean, especially in the British Virgin Islands.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. So we'll start. And then how did the Quakers come to establish a presence in the British Virgin Islands?
Yeah, I mean, like many of these questions, it's a long story. The really short version is that they didn't, in a sense, come and settle there so much as people who were already living there converted to Quakerism. The BVI at the time, this is in the 1730s and 40s when this community is just starting to form. It's pretty far on the marginal end of the Caribbean. It's not like Barbados or Jamaica, these big plantation economies with lots of wealth and trade and large populations, of course, and as we'll talk about much of that based on race-based slavery. The British Virgin Islands was much more marginal, and the people there were relatively poor, and they had a lot of trouble communicating or connecting to the outside world often. So the British Virgin Islands, I should just mention really quickly in case folks don't know where they are. We're talking about the northeast corner of the Caribbean, the end of the Leeward Islands. So just east of Puerto Rico, and that's where you have what's today the U.S. Virgin Islands, the ones folks might be more familiar with, especially if they're Americans or Canadian. And then the British Virgin Islands are right next to them. You could sort of almost swim. Well, somebody who's better at swimming than I am, at least, maybe could swim between the two of it, though. I don't necessarily recommend that. So a bunch of pretty small islands. The British Virgin Islands have about 50 or 60 little islands. Tortola is the main one. And in the 1740s and 50s, there were very few trading contacts for the small plantations, some sugar plantations, a lot of cotton plantations, all again run on the enslavement of people of African descent, but on a much smaller scale than those big islands that people have maybe got more of a sense of what this time period was like there. So with some of these pretty limited connections, the folks who did show up to trade, I think had kind of outsized influence. And when it was harder to get your products to market or to sell them, when folks would only come by to trade once or twice a year, you did have connections from, especially from Liverpool, who would come down, and some of those captains were connected to the Quaker community in England. And in the 1730s, one or two people started who were already planters in the British Virgin Islands, especially a particularly relatively wealthy and powerful person named John Pickering, decided that they were going to be Quakers, and they converted to Quakerism. What it means to convert in a religion in an anthropological sense, and of course, as folks may or may not know, archaeology, the way it's done in America and Canada, is a part of anthropology. So archaeologists are also historical anthropologists, so we sort of think about things in those terms. Converting to a different religion is a kind of a complicated process, because you don't just stop being who you are and start being someone else. You come in with all of your ideas and thoughts and things. And the folks who converted to Quakerism had a kind of a limited knowledge of what that actually meant in some ways. And so you get these really interesting letters in the early 1740s where they're writing questions about, okay, well, now we're Quakers. What does that mean about this thing? Or we've heard about this phenomenon. How does that actually work, right? So they're sort of getting lessons in setting up a Quaker meeting group.
The Quaker community in the British Virgin Islands, how did they respond? Because I know you mentioned about some questions, but how did they respond to the institution of slavery?
Yeah, this is a really big topic, and we'll probably talk a lot about it as we go. And the answer is there's several layers to the answer. One of which is that the Quakers in general get a lot of much deserved credit for the abolition work that they did in the 19th century and at the very end of the 18th century in England, in the US, especially against advocating the end of the slave trade, which they succeeded at in 1807, and eventually for the end of slavery, which in the British Virgin Islands and in the UK, the British colonies came in 1834 with apprenticeship to 1838. A lot of that, Quakers rightly get credit for influencing and arguing for that. Before that time, the relationship of Quakerism to slavery was a lot more complicated, a lot more ambivalent. And again, this is a huge topic, but for the first century or so of the existence of Quakerism, when it was sort of formed as this sort of nebulous group in the 1640s and then became a kind of an organized group in the 1660s or 70s, there's much discussion about equality and nonviolence, but in many ways, they didn't really seem to think a whole lot about the way slavery was connected to those things. And in fact, Quaker communities, even in England and Philadelphia, for the most part, didn't really say much about Quakerism and slavery. So they didn't say much about slavery until much later. So the period where, and in fact, there were Quaker communities in the Caribbean other than the British Virgin Islands. The BVI is actually a kind of an odd little Quaker group, because it popped up long after the end of these other much more substantial and organized and larger communities of Quakerism in the Caribbean. There were 5 different meeting houses and large numbers of Quaker converts in Barbados, for instance, in the 1660s and 70s, and they had a large Quaker community in Jamaica as well, of whom there are much fewer traces. So, and all of these people, they were not sitting there in their sort of stereotypical Quaker, broad-brimmed hats and dark cloaks, shaking their fingers at all the people who were using enslaved people for labor. They were the same people. They owned plantations. They owned ships that traded in enslaved people. They didn't see it as a necessarily problematic thing. And so the folks who were doing that in the British Virgin Islands were much the same, even though the context is kind of different. There's a great quote that is from William Penn, who, as people may know, is one of the founding members of Quakerism, and certainly one of the early supporters that founded the colony of Pennsylvania, and set up Philadelphia, which is why Philadelphia, of course, became a major center for Quakerism then and now. And there's a quote I happen to have here. He says, "So though God is made of one blood, all nations," meaning everyone is equal, he hasn't ranged or dignified them upon the level, but in a sort of subordination and dependency. So the British social structure, which was so based on class distinctions between wealthier people, the landed gentry, and the merchant middle class and the working poor, it really is hard to step outside that. And I think people don't, when they convert, their religion, of course, they're not suddenly stopping, as I said before, who they were, what they're thinking. So the early Quaker community, it talks a lot about equality, but in a lot of senses early on, they're talking about equality before God. And I mean, that's pretty cool, right? And it's got some neat implications for them. They had this crazy idea that women could have insight from God as well. And so you should listen to women and not just only have men be the teachers in your communities. But it also means that the modern understanding of the word equal or nonviolent or, isn't necessarily the way that people understood it in the 1640s and 50s and 60s when Quakerism was forming. And it's also not the way they understood it in the 1740s, 50s, and 60s when this community of Quakers existed in the British Virgin Islands.
Yeah, no, definitely. You definitely mentioned a lot of the different layers, and we'll probably get to some of that. So, but one question I do have is, were there any notable Quaker individuals or families in the British Virgin Islands who played a significant role in opposing slavery?
So there are definitely some things that are different about the BVI, and there are some things that there are some stories and some people who are some better recorded and some less recorded, who certainly by the end of the Quaker group, when it sort of stopped being a formally organized group in the 1760s or so, started seeing things a little bit differently, I think. The most famous is a story of the family called the Nottingham family, which is actually the one exception to what I said earlier about mostly this being a community of people who were already planters in the British Virgin Islands who converted to Quakerism. The one member of the group who was from England and came there as a mission to help teach Quakerism and to spread Quakerism early on after those first couple of converts was a guy named Samuel Nottingham. And he married a wealthy widow of the BVI and took over her plantation and ran it with her. He at first so the story and that is often told about him is how he and Mary, they freed their enslaved people and gave them their plantation and moved back to England. And there's a lot of truth to that is the basis of a community which is still very vibrant and important in the East End of Tortola called Long Look. I was just down there with a local descendant of people connected to this organization a couple of weeks ago. It's still a sort of a center point on the island. The actual story of what happened day to day is a little more complicated. For one thing, Samuel and Mary Nottingham did eventually cause their enslaved people to be freed, and they did give them the land that they'd held, but they waited 20 years to do it. They didn't see anything wrong with sort of taking the profit that they'd made off of that and going back to England to retire. So yes, there are stories. There's another couple of stories about people who the short version that we hear about in the history books is sort of we woke up one day and realized slavery was wrong and they decided to do something about it. And that's great and better late than never. But those stories are also a little more complicated. The interesting upshot of it, though, is you do have, and this is only one of the reasons why this is true, but even before slavery ended in the British Virgin Islands, you have a lot more people of African descent who were free, who were, as a result of people who, as influenced by their conscience, a lot of the Quaker connections there, also because of economic conditions. And other things. But you do have these relatively large communities of free people of African descent in the BVI quite substantially before the end of slavery. The formed that community in Tortola on formerly the Nottingham plantation They did that starting in the 1780s and 1790s. And so, this is 50, 60 years before the end of enslavement and slavery in the British colonies. So, when I talk about this community, it sounds like there's a bit of a drumbeat of, listen, it wasn't as great as it sounds. They're not a bunch of abolitionists, do-gooders. They're a bunch of people who are living in a social context, and just like all of us are, and that leads to complicated and kind of contradictory actions and attitudes. And I think all that's true, but I won't try to drown out the other things that maybe came out of this that were a little more positive, like the formation of those communities that could survive. So yeah, it was a bit of both.
Yeah, because I mean, as you said, there's a lot of different layers, there's a lot of different complexities to Quakers, and once you say that name, you just think abolitionists only, but there's different from the different islands. It's definitely different, and I think when you mentioned about the Nottinghams who owned their plantation, but owned it for 20 years before then leaving it to their enslaved individuals, right? So, I mean, how did this balance of their economic interest with their ethical stance on slavery, how were they able to balance it? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think economics is a really interesting part of this. And again, as an anthropologist, one of the things the anthropologist brings to the table when you talk about what it is we're adding to the conversation is we really like to think about the interconnections of all of these different social forces, right? You really can't talk about economy without talking about social relations, without talking about ideology, without talking about technology. I mean, all of these things are interconnected. I think this is one of the really interesting parts about the story of Quakerism in the BVI. I think that part of the reason the group was successful and formed was actually economic. And I'll couch this by saying, I'm not talking about theological issues. I will leave that to the ministers and the priests and the rabbis and the imams. I'm talking about as an anthropologist looking at social groups. So I'm not suggesting that people are dishonest in their belief or anything like that. But I do think that you do have social implications of joining the religious community you join and what that does. The time that the BVI and the BVI when this group was coming into existence is again, like I said, the BVI was very peripheral at this time. There's no real governmental structure. There's a deputy governor who was on the island in the teens and 20s and 30s. The deputy governor didn't even necessarily live on Tortola, but was somebody from some completely different island who would drop in every once in a while. Even in the 1740s and 50s, there's no governmental structure. There's no police force. There's no military. There's no public buildings, right? There's no church. There's some possibility of a small church at one place, but there's no real nothing positive about that. The churches that we have today are from the 18 teens, the big ones in Roadtown. There's no court or anything like that. So, we're talking about a lot of very disconnected people. There's also, if people haven't been to the BVI, it's a very mountainous area. It's very steep and rocky. It's very difficult to get from one plantation to the next unless you're sailing, and that you can be stuck with weather and stuff. So it's the community offered a kind of a social glue for people to connect to each other, and that's one of the things about Quakerism. We haven't really talked much about the overview of Quakerism, but in very big broad brush, the idea of the earliest Quaker community is that there is that of God in everyone. So all people are equal before God and are always able to commune with God directly. You don't need a minister. You don't need a special building like a church. You don't need to have gone to school to study it. You can just hear what God wants to speak to you, which is a lovely idea and it has lovely implications. But some of the implications for the 17th century and 18th century Quakers are things like if all parts of life are supposed to be holy, you can't say that one building is holy, the church, and other buildings are not holy, the house. Everything has to be holy. You can't say Sunday is the day to be holy and not Tuesday, because you have to be holy on Tuesday too, right? So they rejected things like having to have a special place to worship and a special person to lead it, and thought that you can just get together. And this is still how Quaker worship works today. Communities meet together and sit in silence and wait for someone to feel that God is speaking to them and share what they share. And in a place, in a context where you're very much on the margins of European society, even for the Caribbean. You're in a place which is full of many kinds of dangers. When war is declared between England and or Britain and Spain, there's very little stopping a Spanish ship from dropping into Tortola and taking anything they want. You're, of course, building your whole social and economic structure on race-based slavery, and you're doing that with the threat or actual violence against all of the people of African descent. So the chances of resistance, right, of people fighting back to reassert their own rights is always very high. And so a community that offered this kind of social connection was very appealing. And I think that's one of the reasons why this community was successful in this particular time and place. And with those social connections also come economic connections. So for the wealthy people, there was the chance of a real ongoing interaction between the merchants in England, who were Quaker merchants who would send the ships down, or the Quaker ship captains, who would give them an opportunity to get their merchandise, to market. Quakerism always had, especially in the early century or so of it, when it was sort of separated from mainstream life because of the beliefs that they had to have a mutual support network to aid each other, because they weren't allowed to take part in a lot of parts of normal British life. And so that offered a real lifeline to these relatively poor small planters in the BVI. The poorer ones could connect to the richer ones through it, and the richer ones could connect to the country abroad. And that had real direct economic implications. There's one really specific example. One of the sites that I spent probably the most time on is a little plantation on a small island called Liljost van Dyke, and it was the home of a family named Letsum. Okay. And one of the sons of this community was born in the 1740s, right when this community was getting going, and his parents were active members of the Quaker community for the 1740s. One of these people born into this community, John Coakley Letsum, these Quaker connections were what allowed him to be sent to England for schooling at the age of I think he was 6 years old at the time. And not only are there no police force or government structure, there's no schools in the BVI at this time. So anyone who's going to learn more than the very basic ability to write their name and read a very, very basic document is going to have to go away. And that's going to be a very expensive thing for a very small planter without a lot of money. So it was those Quaker connections that led to his ability to get an education. He eventually went on to become a medical doctor and become quite famous in England in the early, turn of the century, late 18th, early 19th century, founded an organization which is still there, the Medical Society of London. And it's actually partially because of him that in this time and place where we have very few documents and records, we actually have quite a lot of information about this community and other things like letters and documents that probably wouldn't have survived otherwise. So, in lots of ways, big and small, for individuals and for the whole group, economics and of course, again, remembering that the economics are tied up with slave-based labor, economics are tied up with this religious community in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then, what would you say in terms of what kind of relationships did the Quakers have with their enslaved people in the British Virgin Islands? And did these relationships blend in with what was expected in society in British Virgin Islands?
I think for the most part they did blend in. I mean, to boil it down to a one sentence answer, I think that the generalize, because we're talking about a lot of different people and their situations are going to be very different with each other. We're talking, I think a lot of people think about slavery and they think about sort of Gone with the Wind, big plantation house, and especially in all of the BVI, I think that's pretty different, but especially in the smaller and the poorer plantations, we're talking about somebody who is probably the owner of the plantation, the enslaver, is probably out in the fields working alongside the enslaved people that they are holding at the same time, because the work needs to be done and they're not wealthy enough to have enough people to do all of it. And so I think that on these especially these small and marginal plantations, which are the ones that I've studied most carefully, because they're not the ones that are represented in written records, the way people saw themselves was defined, I think, first by that relationship, that racially defined relationship of free and enslaved. And it has some things that are a little bit odd and different for plantations, partly, I think, because of the need and the desire for the owners of the site to sort of set themselves apart from the people that they're holding enslaved. So many plantation sites are built on premises of sort of observation and management, and so you can make sure that you can see the workers' houses, the enslaved people's houses, excuse me, and you can see the fields where they're doing their work. And that's not the case in this particular site, where they're actually sort of separated by a bend in the hill and they're kind of disconnected from each other. The house is kind of oriented towards making a sort of a view, or performing a view towards the main center of economics in the BVI, toward Tola, rather than making a statement towards the enslaved people, which is sort of what you see on many other Caribbean plantations. So I think that for the most part, there's a lot of people who will talk, and sometimes you get in articles about Quakers in the BVI, folks who will say things like, oh, they were nicer to their enslaved people, or things like that. I don't think that there's any actual evidence that that's the case. I mean, the things that that get used as evidence for that are products of they need to be read with a grain of salt. Stories about what happened. A story about what happened when this one planter who first converted to Quakerism, John Pickering, died. Other planters wrote about how his enslaved people were so upset, and they went and they were crying, and it was so terrible because they loved their master so much. I think that story is probably at the very best was much misunderstood by the white people who wrote it down, that was actually happening. For one thing, obviously when an enslaver dies, that's a very dangerous time for the people that they hold enslaved. The chances that they will be split up amongst different plantations and heirs, or even sold entirely to some other place, away from their family, away from the people they love, away from the world that they know, however many challenges there are very high. And so, those stories about how much they were loved by the people that they kept enslaved, I think are very, very problematic. I think more interestingly, though, there is, and we're here to talk about the Quaker community, but obviously it's hard to do that without talking about the people that were held on these plantations. And in doing the archaeology of these sites, I've really tried to consider the people who were held enslaved there, because they're not the ones that we have written documents and records about. And so we have, the best thing we've got for them is archaeology, right? Archaeology, it is something that is equally accessible. Everybody leaves the little broken bits of archaeology behind that we can use to study them. The one site I spent a lot of time on, what I see there is actually that this sort of disconnection between the enslaved people and the owners of the island, I think it led to some opportunities for the enslaved people to move around. The archaeology suggests that they were trading with people on the neighboring island, that they were able to collect resources, see resources that were sort of the good stuff, to an extent that you wouldn't necessarily see on other sites. I don't mean to suggest that it was some sort of a nicer version of slavery. There's no such thing, but I do think it shows that they were able to exercise their own agency and become sort of, a little entrepreneurship in their own way of building up lives for themselves within the structures of this, as a result of these sort of need to have a distinction between the planter and the enslaved people. So yeah, lots of different sides to that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I guess what would you say, I guess, is some of the challenges that the Quakers face in maintaining their principles of simplicity and equality? As you mentioned, each one of us, or each one of everybody, has God within them. And how did that, equate in a slave-owning society?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the interesting thing about it is that at the early phases of Quakerism in general and of Quakerism in the BVI, the thing that's perhaps surprising to the modern reader is the lack of difficulty that they seem to have had with it. There are very few mentions of slavery in the records of the Tortola Monthly Meeting, which is the organization that was formed there. And they did create minutes of their meetings and sort of records of some of the things they did, and those records survive in archive. There's very, very few mentions of slavery. There's one moment where there's two members are having a dispute over who owns one particular enslaved person, and the meeting is sort of adjudicating the answer. It's not a question of this is a person being treated as property, and they're settling the property dispute. There's one really quite amazing passage which I wrote about in the book that I wrote about all of this. That is, and I can't get the quote off the top of my head, but it's something to the effect of that they're worried about when they do start discussing and thinking about slavery towards the end of the meeting. They're sort of worried about it, but they're worried not so much that slavery is wrong or what they're doing to the enslaved people is wrong. They're worried that that slavery causes in them the sin of pride because they have this power over these other people, and it makes them feel too good about themselves. And so they are prideful, and therefore they are sinning. So it's almost like they're worried about the damage slavery does to them morally, which is ironic from the modern perspective, who would say, yes, there's a moral problem with slavery here, but it's not in quite the same way. So there's a really substantial book about this that goes into it in greater detail than I've done in my writing, by McDaniel and Jewell, called Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, which is a really complete, I think, or much more complete than we've seen before, look at the whole relationship of Quakerism overall and slavery, both primarily actually in like Philadelphia and England, the real centers of Quakerism. So in those early decades, the problem really wasn't so much slavery and equality and violence in the way a modern reader thinks about it. I do think it's interesting in the BVI that slavery may have been involved in the end of the meeting in a sort of a strange side way, because it's really this time when the forming that the rest of Quakerism at large is actually starting to come around to the opinion that they are, again, well known for in the 19th century, when they are active abolitionists and do much good work. The London meeting, I may get the dates somewhat wrong, but I'll refer folks to my book, my writing on it. The London meeting starts to tell its members that they really shouldn't be involved in buying or selling enslaved people in the slave trade itself in the late 1750s, I think, or early 1760s. And again, their concern is not so much the physical day-to-day reality of slavery, it's that the buying of people into slavery in West Africa causes wars between the different African nations who have wars in order to capture people to sell into slavery, which is, of course, true, but it's a sort of an odd thing to be concerned about when you're looking at the whole, crime of slavery overall. That's the only part that they seem to start objecting to. I should say, again, it's always impossible to generalize these large groups of people, and not every Quaker thought about things. Not every Quaker was all right with this. There's actually a group that I have a personal connection with that's recorded as making the very first Quaker objection to slavery as early as, I believe it's 1683, which is the Germantown Monthly Meeting of Friends, which is a small group outside of Philadelphia. And I'm not a Quaker, a member of a Quaker group, but I did go to a Quaker school for my elementary, my early education, and it was that school that was run by that community. So good for them, good for Germantown Monthly Meeting for being the first first objection to objection of Quakers to slavery, of which I am aware, but they were pretty rare until the 1760s and 1770s. And so I think it's really in that period, right when the Quaker community on Tortola is kind of breaking up, and there aren't really active meetings anymore. They aren't sending letters. They aren't reporting back to the meeting in London. And it's, it's probably not a coincidence that it's this time when London, Philadelphia are starting to say, hey, really, maybe we need to think about this whole slavery thing. This is actually much bigger problem than maybe we've been thinking about. Maybe this is not consistent with our ideology, with our ideals, and maybe we should start talking to people who are connected to it. That the people in the British Virgin Islands, a couple like the Nottinghams that I mentioned before, getting at least some credit for removing themselves from that situation. But the vast majority of people who were connected to the Quaker community in Tortola around this time is when they all start drifting apart from each other and not having a Quaker community anymore, just at the same point that Quakers in the cores of Quakerism are saying slavery is a real problem.
No, definitely. And I guess what would you say was the impact of the Quaker beliefs and the actions on the abolition movement in the British Virgin Islands and, of course, the wider Caribbean?
Surprisingly limited influence early on, and maybe that conflict between Quakers in the core that are starting to recognize the problems with slavery that are sort of apparent to us were maybe scaring off the folks who were connected to that group in Tortola. Those who were practicing Quakerism in Tortola, I think, were not ever really seeing the enslaved people they held as part of that community, right? It was, in fact, in some ways, it was maybe part of the social construction of both their religion and their race and their national identity, these big elements of who they are, to distinguish themselves from the people they held enslaved. So I think that that part of it from that side didn't necessarily have a lasting impact. I do think that you may see some connection, and you may get there may be some connection to this, as I mentioned before, a much larger, on average, than elsewhere in the Caribbean, groups of free people of African descent, like the Long Look people and other communities. I again want to hesitate before giving too much credit to Quakerism for those creation of those communities. I think the communities are the ones who did the work of building their communities, especially before slavery ended, where they had this sort of weird liminal situation where they were, they were suffering the same problems of race-based slavery, but without being enslaved themselves. They were being limited by those colonial structures. And in the 19th century, the BVI does become, again, very different than the rest of the Caribbean. And it's again why I think the BVI is a great place to do research, in that you have a very large number of smallholders, folks who are of African descent, after slavery, but even before slavery ended in some places, who own their own land, who own it outright. They aren't sharecroppers or tenants. And it's small parcels, but they are supporting their own family and building their communities. And obviously that was a thing that happened elsewhere, but I think that happened to a much higher degree. There's a BVI historian, BVI Islander, who is also a historian, Michael O'Neill, who's written a great book about this, the title of which escapes me, but maybe we can give a link to it. That is about this community, these communities that developed in the 19th century. And so, even today, most of the land in the British Virgin Islands is held by the descendants of the people who actually did the work, right? The people who are African descent, rather than the descendants of the white plantation owners, as it often is the case in, again, these bigger islands, Barbados and Jamaica. Still, the land is often owned by those absentee owners in England who are of European descent. And I think, again, I hesitate to give Quakerism credit and say the simple story is, oh, they were nice, so there was a better foundation for that. But maybe in a side way, the presence of Quakerism, the presence of these communities of free people of African descent helped build that helped build that phenomenon. And so by the 19th century, you have a lot of BV Islanders who own their own land. Pretty much all of BVI was small plantations owned by people of African descent. Plantations is not the right word. Farms for people of African descent who were, building their communities. Yeah.
What would you say is the most surprising or the impactful discovery you made about Quakers while researching this book?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you had talked to me, 20 years ago or so when I started doing this work, coming from a background that had familiarity with Quakerism, I would have not predicted the extent to which the folks who were Quakers in that Quaker community didn't see the things that I think are obvious to us now about.
What are, I guess, lessons that contemporary society can learn from the Quaker experience in the British Virgin Islands?
Yeah, so we have a great phrase in archaeology that's the past is a foreign country. And it's an old line, and it never ceases to amaze me how surprised I am, I guess, about a lot of the different things we find and a lot of the different things that people do. This holding together the idea of Quakerism and slavery and not seeing what to us in the modern world is an obvious contradiction.
Yeah.
It's often really easy and kind of necessary in our world to talk about big groups of people as if they're kind of monolithic. And I think we do that a lot with Quakerism, but as we've been talking about for the last however long, it's really hard to sum up a group, even a relatively small group, not just talking about nations like Americans or Canadians or British people or people in the 18th century or things like that. But even a relatively small group like Quakerism had a whole lot of different phases that the whole group as a whole went through, and a lot of different ways of expressing those ideas and working out those ideas. One of the things that I take away from my research as an anthropologist is the extent to which all of these communities and religious groups and other kinds of groups are formed in a local context. There is no sort of magical real thing called Quakerism sitting up there on a bookshelf somewhere that people are trying to match, right? Quakerism is built up of all the little actions that people do every day as Quakers. And so you have this sort of inherent diversity to what people do as a member of a group. And that's really clear with Quakerism over time, from these early sort of not even thinking about slavery to being kind of okay with it, to being not okay with it, to being the leading force against it. With Quakerism, in London versus in the north of England versus in Philadelphia versus in the Caribbean, these groups are complicated and diverse. So there's a tendency, especially the last couple of decades of social media, to try to soundbite everything. And there's some really great archaeologists and historians who are doing great work in being public figures and communicating the complexities of archaeology on TikTok, on Twitter, on Instagram. And so I'm not knocking those folks and saying they shouldn't be doing that. They're doing great work. But it's also important to remember that when you soundbite any historical story, any episode like that, you're losing a lot, right? And so, maybe the takeaway is, that the past is going to be very different than the present. The past is a foreign country, and that difference is going to be complicated and diverse. So if you think you have an understanding of a situation, if you think you've got it boiled down to a couple of sentences, you're missing a ton. And that doesn't mean we can't have big takeaways from our studies and things like that. But don't forget all the details that are built into these stories. There's a lot of complexity there.
Yeah, there's all different layers to that, and I guess as long as we're having the conversation, then that will certainly help the narrative to continue. And Professor Chenoweth, as we kind of end this discussion, how would you say that we can ensure that the history of Quakers in the British Virgin Islands is preserved and, of course, respected?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And for all I've sort of had a critical tone in parts of this, and I think it's a really fascinating story that needs to be preserved and needs to be shared. And the physical sites on the ground, sort of as an archaeologist, the physical sites on the ground and the material remains of this group, I think, are important to protect. I think the best way to do that is to protect all of the historic and heritage sites and all of the history and heritage of the BVI. There are a lot of people doing amazing work on exactly this, down there every day on the ground. The folks at the Department of Culture, the folks at the Archives and Records Management Unit, the folks at the Virgin Island Studies of the Community College, H. Lavity Stout Community College down on Tortola. These people are doing incredible work, and as it is everywhere, I'm not picking out the BVI in general, but everywhere, the archivists, librarians, the museums, the historians, they're the under-resourced group, right? They're the last ones to get the funding. They're on the same computer they've had for 35 years, still putting in floppy disks, right? And everywhere that's the problem. The folks in the BVI are doing great work to try and raise the profiles of these sites, the interest in them from folks who would come in as tourists who want to see them, and who want to preserve the sites that are left. As with anywhere, what's left is a tiny handful compared to all of the sites that used to be there 250, 300 years ago. And I think that, protecting the story of BVI Quakers, which is a really interesting and unique story that we can all learn something from, is going to be an important part of protecting the story of all of the BVI, which is, as I've touched on here and there, again, it's pretty different than a lot of the other parts of the Caribbean that we've had more historical work done, more archival records survive, more archaeology has been done, and bigger islands or more populous islands. The way history worked out in the BVI is really different than it worked out there, and I think we can learn some valuable lessons from that as our own society tries to struggle with the results of colonialism, the results of slavery still today. And the BVI offers a really interesting and really unique perspective on that. So short answer is let's give those guys the funding that they deserve and the support that they deserve, and hopefully the Quaker story will come along for the ride with the bigger, and I'd say bigger story of BVI culture.
Yes, definitely. And thank you so much for coming on. I really do appreciate it. And I will put the show note in the links to some of the references that you mentioned in the show notes, so people can be able to browse that at their leisure. But again, I just really wanted to thank you to talk about it, because again, Quakers, we only know of just one side of the story, but there are many different layers, and we talked at least to some of that. And again, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Wendy. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.